The actor replacing Donald Glover in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 is very exciting after he appeared in one of the most critically acclaimed movies of 2024. Mr. and Mrs. Smith is a TV adaptation of the 2005 film, and follows spies in arranged marriages who go on undercover missions together. The show's first season starred Glover as John Smith and Maya Erskine as Jane Smith. The series began with them committed to being professionals as they lived and worked with one another, but John and Jane eventually fell in love in Mr. and Mrs. Smith. However, their fates at the end of Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 were left ambiguous. The couple was trapped in a safe room within their house with only one bullet left after fighting off another Smith duo. Glover's John Smith was also bleeding out from a gunshot wound. Season 1 of Mr. and Mrs. Smith ended with 3 gunshots shown from the outside of their home, not revealing the final outcome of the fight. After Season 1's cliffhanger ending, Mark Edelstein's casting in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 is very exciting, especially following his performance in Honora. Mark Edelstein's Honora role makes his John casting in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 more exciting. Mark Edelstein was one of the highlights of Honora. Mark Edelstein is a Russian actor who has broken out this year with the Sean Baker-directed film Honora. In Honora, Edelstein plays Ivan, the son of a wealthy Russian oligarch who meets an exotic dancer named Honora and eventually proposes to her. Ivan and Honora end up getting married, but their wedding is immediately disputed by his family, who fly to America to get it annulled. Honora blends several genres together, and has aspects of the romance, comedy, drama, and even thriller genres, which proves that Edelstein is a perfect fit for Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2. Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 also blended all the aforementioned genres together, so it is likely that Season 2 will follow suit. While Edelstein proved his talents as an actor in Honora, he played a very naive young man in the film, so Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 will likely present him with a completely different character. Since he will be playing a spy in the series, Edelstein's John Smith will have to be capable of protecting himself and his partner in dangerous situations. Mark Edelstein's Mr. and Mrs. Smith casting hint Season 2 will be completely different from Season 1. Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 will differentiate itself from the first season. Since Mr. and Mrs. Smith is being treated as an anthology series, there will be major differences between the two seasons. Edelstein's casting proves that Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 may tackle different spy genre tropes. Edelstein is a Russian actor, which suggests that Season 2 could deal with themes such as Russian espionage, which is a hallmark of many spy movies and shows that Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 did not explore. It's also possible that Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 could be set in drastically different locations, and possibly even have episodes set in Russia. It's also important to note Edelstein's age compared to Glover. Edelstein is only 22 years old, whereas Glover was 40 in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1. Therefore, Edelstein will without a doubt be a completely different protagonist compared to Glover, since his John Smith will likely be a lot more reckless and naive on missions. Since Edelstein is so much younger than Glover, how he handles conflict in a relationship will also be much different. This will make the relationship dynamic between the titular couple in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 much more interesting and unpredictable.